So we could perhaps say that the rock has being. It's not simply an abstract understanding of different beings, but it has being itself, or it has being, I would say. So when we talk about the existence of God, it would be understood as the source of all being, or the source of all substance, if you want to talk about substance as well, something that has a being and exists independently as its own entity or thing. So God would be the source of being and have unlimited being. He would be being itself, because you could say that all things in the world around us that has being are limited in some sense. They have some things that they can do, some properties, but there are some things that they can't do. That there's some things that they are unable to do because their nature or essence prevents them from doing this or that on the other thing. But with God, his essence or being is unlimited. He's not limited by anything at all. So he would be understood as being in the same sense, or not in the same sense, but at least we would have being, and other things in the world also has being. Now, of course, there is this understanding in the classical theistic tradition, like St. Thomas Aquinas talked about this, that when we talk about the existence of God or being of God, we cannot understand that directly, but rather analogously. That being in this world is rather an analogy to the complete and full and supreme being of God. For instance, when it comes to this idea of analogy of being, which Thomas Aquinas talked about, we have analogies that we talk about things in different levels. For instance, when you eat some great breakfast, you could say this breakfast was good, and then you have another sense of the word good when you talk about this person is a good man. Then you talk about goodness in a higher and other sense, but still there is still a connection with goodness being in food that is good, and also goodness in a morally good person. There is still a similarity between those two terms, but still there is a difference as well. So one would perhaps say that the being of God is in that sense, it's on a higher level. So we can it has something to do with the being in the world around us, but it's even in a higher and more supreme sense, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, that was interesting. Thank you. I think I have a question. So as you were talking, I wondered if you would agree that what you have been trying to describe as God sounds to me a little bit like the concept of existence. So it's because if you ask what is existence, then it's also very hard to really say it. It's just that, yes, some things exist. And so I'm just thinking how to put it in words. So yes, you said, for example, different things exist, but they are limited in what they can do, because they have maybe different characteristics or limitations. But then it reminds me a little bit of Plato. I wanted to bring up this distinction, Plato and Aristotle, this idea that what is existence as such, which I find is kind of a difficult concept to grasp, but it seems to me as if what you have been describing as God, as like the basis or foundation of all existence, that this is something quite similar to this concept of existence in a pure sense, if you want to talk a little bit like Plato.
Yeah, that's a good question, a very good question. I suppose one would say that when you talk about the concept of existence, the concept itself would be abstract. It would just be a concept. But when talking about God, he's not. One would say that he's not just abstract, but it has a real, and perhaps people would say a concrete being or essence. Perhaps one would say that his being is higher than concept. So maybe one could say that when I talk about the concept of existence itself, refers to or has the content of being itself, the very being, not the concept of being, but the very being itself, which God is. Because one wouldn't say that God is just an abstract concept, but rather the supreme, real, and perhaps people would say concrete reality of being, not just the concept, but the source of being itself, and it has being itself, not the concept of being, but being itself. I'm not sure if that helped answer the question, but yeah, what do you think of this?
I think it sounds still very similar to Plato to me, because of course Plato, as far as I understand, would say that the pure whatever the pure form or the pure existence is, of course, higher in his view than each concrete entity that actually exists, because everything that we see in the world is just like an imperfect shadow of the perfect form which exists in some higher world. So if you say that God is not just an abstract concept, but he exists real, but somehow higher than concepts or than reality, then it still reminds me quite a lot of Plato, I think.
Well, I could perhaps mention that there is this theistic view called divine idealism, which sort of put the Platonic ideas about forms and abstract concepts in the theistic tradition, or more specifically the Christian Neoplatonic tradition. And it would talk about the relationship between the forms and God, in the sense that those concepts exist objectively, but as thoughts in the mind of God. Because some people would argue that concepts or forms are something that exists in a sense that they are thought of by a mind, a mental reality, because we contain concepts when we think about them in our mind. So the concepts are related to some mind thinking about them. And since the concepts exist objectively, as Plato would say, it would therefore exist as thought in the supreme mind, which is God. So suppose that would be a relationship people would, or in the classical tradition at least, people would point out. But I would also say that it's absolutely true that there are many similarities between the Platonic forms and God himself. You could really see and compare and find a lot of interesting things. For instance, Plato would talk about the form of the good being it's sort of his God, Plato's God. That's the supreme form of everything. Every single other form participates perhaps in this ultimate form of goodness. And I think the classical theistic tradition would completely agree with that when it comes to God as well. He is supreme goodness in itself. So I suppose you could say that those considerations about the Platonic forms, which you talked about just now, are in fact true of God as well. That he is perfect, he is supreme, he is unchangeable, he is truly the supreme being, supreme goodness, and everything else is good and real insofar as it participates in supreme existence and goodness of God. So I think in these senses, we could talk about the Platonic forms being equal or similar to God in these contexts, if that helps answer the question.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. I was thinking just now that it seems to me almost like it's a little funny. There is always this, basically, if we look at the world, there are higher and higher abstractions or overall categories, and then there are always smaller and smaller aspects of these things. And so what it seems to me almost is as if there is always in people this question, from which side do you look at it? So I think the materialists or Aristotle or the scientific people, they look at it kind of from the bottom up. So they see all the small entities, and then they say, okay, if these entities are combined, then the form in which they are organized emerges, and so the form and organization exists as a consequence of the small entities existing. And so they build the whole worldview from the bottom up. And then there is the other possibility, which is more the Plato possibility, that you look at the world from the top down. So you say, no, there is this, the highest, perfect, best entity which contains everything and is the foundation of everything. And then from this downward, different smaller entities exist which mirror the higher entity to a certain extent, but not completely. So you would say the materialists or the Aristotle types would say small things come together to build larger things, which are then maybe have emergent properties. And the Plato types would say large things have like echoes which have some aspect, but not all aspect of the large things, which are then the smaller things. So does that make any sense to you?
Yes, I understand, and yeah, that's very understandable that you sort of can compare and talk about bottom up or top to bottom approach when it comes to this metaphysical worldview. And that seems very true, that yes, in the more, you could say, Aristotelian or materialist sense, it's about things here at bottom that give rise to these forms or essences. But in Platonic worldview, it would be more the forms, and then everything else participates in those forms. And that would certainly be true in the theistic tradition as well, with the top to bottom, in the sense that God is the highest being, he is the supreme being, and then everything else participates in that. However, when it comes to arguments for the existence of God, most of them would argue from the bottom to the top, that we can look at things around us, concrete things that we can observe or discover, and reflect from that there must be a higher cause or an ultimate being that caused them to exist. So it would logically reflect about things around us, and by that logically conclude that there is this higher being. So the arguments would be more of a bottom to top approach, but the reality, the metaphysics of this worldview would be top to bottom, I suppose. Yeah, so that's an interesting reflection there. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good way to look at it, that theism is basically a top-down metaphysics. So you start with the top, with the perfect, as you said before, never changing, like self-sufficient foundation of all being, and then you say, okay, from this follow now different things which are smaller and have more limited aspects. And materialism is the bottom-up metaphysic, if you so want. So you start with small particles, and then these build things that have properties because of that. So yes, you said that the arguments for God often go from bottom to top, but I'm not sure I would agree. I think sometimes they do, but sometimes also they don't. So for example, you said in the beginning that God is like the foundation of all existence, and therefore we can derive certain of his attributes, like he would be necessary and self-sufficient and unchanging. And I think this is more of a top-down argument, isn't it?
Well, I should perhaps clarify that when I talk about that God would necessarily have these properties like self-sufficiency, etc. That would rather be logical conclusions based on the premise that this is what God is. But then some of the arguments for God existence, like the cosmological argument, wouldn't start with a premise that this is the essence of God. It would just start about, for instance, here we see things around us exist, and from that conclude that there is a God, and from there again, further down the road, you would argue for the properties. So I would, in this sense, what you were talking about was rather fleshing out the properties of God, given that we analyze God, to put it that way. But it's true that there are indeed there is at least one argument which argues more or less from the top to bottom, and that is the ontological argument, which talks about the concept of God as the greatest conceivable being, and derives from that because of this understanding of God, God must exist in reality. There are different versions of this argument, talking about the idea of possible worlds and necessity and all those stuff. But at least that's a very top to bottom approach. But take the contingency argument, or the argument from the motion. It would talk about things in the world around us. We see things change and move, and from there conclude that there must be an unmoved mover, like Aristotle also famously argued for, and then after that have the properties. So I hope that helped to clarify or distinguish things. I hope.
Yes, I think a little bit. I was a little bit stuck on when you said that somehow or other these you look at the world and from there conclude that God has to exist in reality. And I think again here it's very important to maybe be more precise about how, in what sense do we use the word exist here, because I think also as we move from the bottom to the top, things become less and less concrete. They become more and more abstract. So as we said, individual people or individual rocks, for example, exist, but distance or an economic system like socialism doesn't exist in the same level of concreteness, but it exists more abstractly because it's only a relationship between the entities that exist concretely. Now, of course, I'm again using the bottom-up worldview as I always somehow tend to do. But I think in that sense, you would have to, or for me at least, it would only make sense to say that God exists in reality, that this form of existence is somehow a very, very abstract form, like a principle or force or something like that, not like a concrete entity, like a stone.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I suppose a theist like myself would sort of make clear that it's talking about existence in a sense that things have being, that they have existence really and truly and actually, and not simply a relationship of beings, which is more like a short hand for just saying that the beings categorized in this sense.